The dust of Redemption, Montana, tasted of endings. Wren knew the flavor well. It was the same dust that had coated her husband Thomas's lips in his final fever, the same grit that had worked its way into the cracked axle of their wagon, leaving her stranded at the edge of a town that had no use for a widow, with nothing but a worn Bible and hands calloused from work that no longer existed. She had walked the last 5 miles, her worldly possessions bundled in a quilt, the setting sun a merciless eye at her back. Redemption was a single street of false-fronted buildings clawing at the vast, indifferent sky. It had a saloon, a general store, a church with a leaning steeple, and the sprawling, intimidating fences of the Callaway Ranch that seemed to hold the town itself in its fist. The stares she received were not curious, but assessing. They weighed her worn dress, her solitary state, and found her wanting. A woman alone was a problem, a temptation, or a burden. There was no fourth option. For 3 days she survived on the last of her hardtack and the charity of a creek that ran sluggish and brown at the edge of town. She found shelter in a place no one else wanted, an old line shack, abandoned by the Callaway Ranch years ago. It stood perilously close to a bog, a patch of greedy, waterlogged earth that sucked at the reeds and buzzed with insects. The roof leaked and the door hung on one hinge, but it was 4 walls and a place to lay her head out of the wind. She swept the packed dirt floor with a branch of sage, the scent a clean, lonely perfume in the stale air. On the 4th day, she saw him. Judson Callaway. She didn't know his name then, only his presence. He was a figure on a powerful horse, dark and solid against the horizon. He rode the fence line that bordered the bog, his posture rigid, his hat pulled low. He was the owner of the fences, the owner of the land her shack squatted on, the owner of the very ground beneath her feet. He stopped his horse 100 yards away, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated shack and lingering on her as she stood in the doorway. She felt his stare like a physical weight, a judgment. He was powerful but closed, a man who looked at the world as if it were a ledger of debts and trespasses. She was a trespass. He watched her for a full minute, his face an unreadable mask of shadow and sun. Then, without a nod or a sign, he spurred his horse and continued along the fence, a king surveying a corner of his kingdom he'd forgotten existed and was displeased to be reminded of. The encounter left her feeling smaller than she already was, a piece of tumbleweed caught on a wire. The sky broke that night. A furious, late spring storm rolled in from the mountains, unleashing a torrent of rain that turned the dusty street to mud and hammered on her flimsy roof like a fist. Wren lay on her thin pallet, listening to the drips plinking into the tin cup she'd set out, and prayed the whole structure wouldn't collapse around her. Grief was a physical thing, an ache in her bones that resonated with the storm's fury. Thomas had loved the sound of rain on a canvas wagon cover. The memory was so sharp it stole her breath. Sometime near dawn, with the rain softening to a miserable drizzle, a new sound cut through the gloom. It was a sound of pure panic, a terrified, guttural screaming that was half whinny, half sob. It was an animal in mortal distress. Wren sat bolt upright, her heart pounding. The sound came from the bog. Pulling on her damp boots, she threw her worn shawl over her head and pushed open the groaning door. The world was a wash of gray and brown. The bog, swollen with rain, had become a treacherous, moving soup of mud and water. And in the middle of it, sinking fast, was a colt. A beautiful animal, all long legs and terrified eyes, its coat the color of wet copper. It was already in up to its chest, churning the black mud in a frenzy that only dug it deeper. Its nostrils were flared, white-rimmed with fear, and every desperate lunge buried it further in the bog's cold embrace. This was no stray. The colt was too fine, too well-bred. It had to be his. Callaway's, Wren's first instinct was to run for help, to ride to the main ranch house. But a glance at the Colt, its struggles weakening, told her there wasn't time. It would exhaust itself and drown in the muck long before she could return with men. Panic was the bog's greatest ally. She looked around, her mind racing. Her father had taught her about leverage, about using the land's own strength against itself. He'd pulled a bogged cow out once with little more than a mule and a good plank. She had no mule, but she had her own 2 hands and a will forged by hardship. She found what she needed, a long, solid log from a fallen cottonwood near the shack. It was heavy, almost too much for her to manage, but desperation gave her strength. She dragged it, inch by painful inch, to the edge of the bog, positioning it to act as a fulcrum. Then she unspooled the length of rope that had once bound her worldly goods. It wasn't much, but it was strong. Tying one end to a sturdy tree on solid ground, she waded into the cold, sucking mud, the hem of her dress instantly heavy with filth. The colt thrashed as she approached, its eyes wild. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice low and steady, the same voice she'd used to calm spooked oxen on the trail. "Easy, boy. I'm not going to hurt you." The mud was a living thing, pulling at her boots, trying to claim her too. It came past her knees, cold and greedy. She worked her way around to the colt's head, stroking its neck, speaking nonsense words in a soothing rhythm. The animal was trembling, its breathing coming in ragged, panicked gasps. She managed to loop the rope around its neck and under its forelegs, a makeshift harness. The colt fought her, but it was weakening, its struggles becoming more sporadic. She scrambled back to the log, her legs aching from the mud's pull. She threaded the rope over the log, creating a crude pulley. Now came the impossible part. She put her back into it, pulling with every ounce of strength she possessed. The rope bit into her hands. The mud fought her. The colt's dead weight fought her. For a moment, nothing happened. The colt let out a weak, defeated sigh. "No," Wren gritted out between her teeth. "We are not dying today." She repositioned her feet, digging her heels into the slippery bank. She leaned back, using her entire body weight, her muscles screaming in protest. The rope tightened, groaned. Slowly, miraculously, the colt shifted. It was only an inch, but it was an inch of freedom. Heartened, she pulled again, a rhythm of pull, hold, breathe. Pull, hold, breathe. The log creaked. The colt, sensing the movement, found a last reserve of strength and began to flounder forward, working with her instead of against her. It was grueling, soul-crushing work. Mud caked her face and arms, her hair was plastered to her skull, and her hands were raw and bleeding. But she didn't stop. Inch by inch, foot by foot, she hauled the beautiful animal from its grave. Finally, with a great sucking sound, the colt's hindquarters came free, and it scrambled onto the muddy bank, collapsing in an exhausted, trembling heap. Wren fell to her knees beside it, her own strength gone, gasping for air, her body shaking from exertion. She was stroking the colt's wet neck, murmuring to it, when the sound of hoofbeats made her look up. Judson Calloway and 3 of his ranch hands sat on their horses on the rise above the bog. They had seen it. All of it. Judson's face was a storm cloud. He dismounted, his movements stiff with anger, and strode toward her. He didn't see a rescuer. He saw a squatter, a thief, covered in mud, with a rope on his best colt. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" His voice was like grinding stones, cold and furious. He expected her to cower, to explain, to beg. Wren, however, was too exhausted for fear. She just looked up at him from her position on the ground, mud-streaked and weary to the bone. She didn't say a word. She simply gestured with her chin toward the deep, sucking hole in the bog where the colt had been, then back to the shivering, living animal beside her. Judson's eyes followed her gesture. He saw the deep tracks, the discarded log, the taut rope still tied to the tree. He saw his prized colt, the one he'd bred from his best mare, alive and breathing on solid ground. He looked at the woman, small, bedraggled, covered in filth, with rope burns on her raw hands. And he saw that she had done it. Alone. The fury in his eyes faltered, replaced by something else. A flicker of disbelief, of grudging respect, of utter, profound confusion. He had come expecting to confront a thief, and found a miracle instead. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in a long time, Judson Calloway was silent. He stood there, the most powerful man in the territory, looking at the poorest woman in it as if he'd never truly seen another person before. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. His men watched from the ridge, their curiosity a palpable thing. Judson finally found his voice, though it was rougher than usual. "See to the colt," he ordered one of his men, never taking his eyes off Wren. He took a step closer, his gaze dropping to her bleeding hands. A muscle worked in his jaw. He was a man accustomed to giving orders, to solving problems with money or force. He had no protocol for this, for a debt that couldn't be paid in coin. He reached into his coat, but she flinched, a small, involuntary movement that stopped him cold. She thought he was reaching for a weapon or to grab her. The realization landed on him like a physical blow. He let his hand drop. "You're hurt," he stated, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. Wren finally pushed herself to her feet, her knees trembling. She wiped a muddy hand across her cheek, leaving a clean streak on her dirty skin. "I'm fine," she said, her voice raspy with exhaustion. "The colt will be." She looked past him to where his man was now draping a blanket over the shivering animal. She had done what needed to be done. Her part was over. Without another word, she turned and began to walk back toward the shack, her back straight, her dignity a flimsy shield against his powerful stare. She felt his eyes on her every step of the way. The next morning, a knock came at her door. It wasn't the solid, authoritative rap of Judson Calloway, but a more hesitant sound. A young ranch hand stood there, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on his boots. A wagon was behind him, loaded with supplies. "Mr. Calloway sent this," the boy mumbled. He unloaded sacks of flour and beans, a slab of salt pork, coffee, sugar, and a new, sharp axe. There was no note, no message. Just the goods. It was payment. A transaction. It was his way of closing the ledger, of erasing the debt. Wren felt a sting of pride. She hadn't done it for payment, but she was also a practical woman. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Tell him thank you," she said quietly. The boy nodded, relieved, and hurried away as if fleeing a ghost. For a week, she saw no one from the Calloway ranch. She used the flour to bake bread that filled the small shack with a scent of home she thought she'd lost forever. She chopped firewood with the new axe, the clean bite of the blade a satisfying thud. She was stronger, warmer, less hungry. But she was still alone. She expected that to be the end of it. The powerful man had paid his due. But then he appeared again, riding not along the far fence line, but directly to her door. He dismounted, his presence seeming to shrink the very air around the shack. "I need fencers," he said, without preamble. His voice was still gruff, but the hard edge of fury was gone. "The storm took down 1/2 mile of wire along the creek. It's a man's work, but you seem to have a man's strength when it's called for." It wasn't a compliment, not really. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same lack of emotion he might use to describe a horse's conformation. He named a wage. It was fair. More than fair. Wren knew what this was. It wasn't just about the fence. He couldn't have her squatting on his land, a recipient of his charity. That would create gossip, questions. But an employee? That was different. That was a category the town could understand. It put her in a box, defined her role. It was a way for him to keep her here without admitting why. "I can work," she said simply. He nodded, a short, sharp dip of his chin. "My foreman, Sipes, will bring the wire and tools in the morning. You'll answer to me, and me alone." That last part was significant. It was a shield. He was already anticipating trouble and heading it off. He was about to mount his horse when he paused. "That was my best colt," he said, his back still to her. "From my wife's mare. I haven't had a colt out of that line in 5 years." He didn't say thank you, but the words hung in the air between them, heavier and more meaningful than the word itself. He swung into the saddle and rode away, leaving Wren with the ghost of a woman she'd never met, and the weight of a loss she was just beginning to understand. His damage was a wall around him, and she had just found the first crack. The foreman, Sipes, was a man whose cruelty was etched into the lines around his thin mouth. He resented her presence from the moment he saw her. He dropped the spools of wire and the stretchers on the ground with a clang, his eyes running over her with open contempt. "Boss must be getting soft," he sneered, "hirin' strays to do a man's job." Wren ignored him, picking up a pair of fencing pliers. She knew this kind of man. The best way to fight him was to work harder than he did. The work was brutal. Digging post holes in the rocky soil, stretching the barbed wire until her shoulders ached, her hands, already raw, were newly blistered and torn. But there was a clean satisfaction in it. She was earning her keep. She was building something, not just surviving. Judson would ride the line in the afternoons, ostensibly to check her progress. He'd sit on his horse, watching her work. The silences were long, but not empty. One afternoon, he dismounted. "You're pulling it too tight on the corners," he said, his voice low. He came and stood beside her, taking the stretcher from her hands. His knuckles brushed hers. The touch was accidental, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the cold wind. He showed her how to brace the post, how to use her weight to get the tension right without stressing the wire. He was close enough that she could smell the scent of leather and horse and clean sweat. He wasn't a cold, distant landlord anymore. He was a man made of flesh and bone, with sadness in his eyes that he couldn't hide up close. "Where did you learn to work like this?" he asked, his gaze on the fence line, not on her. "My father's farm, in Ohio," she said. "He never had sons. My sister and I were his hands." It was more than she had said to anyone since Thomas died. "He was a good man," she added, the words soft. Judson just nodded, his jaw tight. He understood loss. He handed the tool back to her. "You do good work, Wren," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded different in his mouth. Solid. Real. The slow burn of their connection was built on such moments. It was not in words, but in gestures. One evening, as a cold snap descended, she found a neat stack of chopped oak by her door, far better than the pine she'd been scrounging. Another day, Sipes began to berate her for the pace of her work, his voice loud and bullying. Judson appeared as if from nowhere. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Sipes," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "Ride out to the north pasture. Check the herd. Now." The foreman's face mottled with anger, but he went, casting a look of pure hatred at Wren. Judson turned to her. "He won't bother you again," he promised. He was protecting her, and the knowledge was a warm coal in the center of her chest. The town noticed. Of course they noticed. Redemption was a town that ran on whispers. The whispers started in the general store, presided over by Mrs. Pritchard, a woman whose piety was matched only by her sharp tongue. She had been the town's matriarch for 20 years, and she saw Wren not as a widow to be pitied, but as an interloper, a disruption to the town's delicate social order. Perhaps she had once had hopes for Judson Calloway herself, before or after his wife. Peculiar, isn't it? Mrs. Pritchard said to a group of women, loud enough for Wren, who was trying to buy thread, to hear. How a lone woman happens upon a line shack on his land, and his most valuable colt just happens to get stuck right by her door. A clever trap, if you ask me. The other women murmured in agreement. The narrative was set. Wren wasn't a hero. She was an opportunist. A woman of questionable morals using a poor animal to ensnare the territory's most eligible and vulnerable widower. The chill was immediate. The storekeeper was suddenly out of the smoked bacon she'd seen hanging just a moment before. Women who might have nodded to her on the street now crossed to the other side, gathering their skirts as if she were contagious. The whispers followed her, sharp and stinging as hornets. Sipes, the foreman, fanned the flames among the ranch hands, adding his own crude embellishments to the story. Wren felt the walls of the community closing in, pushing her out. She was as isolated as she had been on her first day, but now the isolation had a name and a face. One afternoon, she was working on a section of fence near a thicket of chokecherry when she heard the panicked bawling of a calf. A young one had gotten itself tangled in the brush, separated from its mother. The mother cow bellowed helplessly from the other side. Without thinking, Wren dropped her tools and pushed her way into the thorny thicket. It was dense, the branches scratching at her face and arms. She reached the terrified calf and began working to free its leg from a tangle of old wire and roots. A branch whipped back and struck her across the forehead, sharp and stinging. She ignored it, finally freeing the calf, which scrambled out of the thicket and back to its mother. As Wren emerged, blinking in the sunlight, dabbing at the cut on her brow, she saw Judson watching her from his horse. He dismounted and walked toward her, his face unreadable. "Are you all right?" he asked. He reached her side and gently took her chin in his hand, tilting her face to the light. His thumb brushed the cut, and she winced. "It's just a scratch," she said, her voice unsteady. His proximity was overwhelming. He pulled a clean kerchief from his pocket. "Hold still," he commanded softly. With a tenderness that seemed entirely out of place for such a hard man, he dabbed at the blood. His fingers were calloused, but his touch was feather-light. His eyes, a deep, stormy gray, met hers. The world seemed to fall away. There was only the wind in the grass, the warmth of his hand on her skin, the unspoken thing that shimmered in the air between them. He was looking at her not as a problem or an employee, but as a woman. His gaze dropped to her mouth. She saw the conflict in him, the desire warring with the deep, ingrained caution, the wall of his grief. He began to lean in. The sound of approaching riders shattered the moment. He dropped his hand as if her skin had burned him and stepped back, his face instantly closing off, the mask of the cold rancher slamming back into place. By the time Sipes and another hand rode up, he was all business, pointing out the stray calf and giving orders. But Wren had seen it. She had seen the man behind the wall, and the knowledge was both terrifying and exhilarating. That night, for the first time since Thomas's death, she didn't just feel grief or exhaustion. She felt the sharp, aching pang of a new and impossible longing. She knew he felt it too. The distance he kept for the next few days was a testament to it. He still checked the fence line, but from a greater distance. He was fighting it, fighting himself. Wren understood. He was a man defined by what he had lost. To want again was to risk losing again. So she found a way to speak to him in the silent language they had developed. She noticed he often worked through the supper hour, returning to the ranch house long after dark. One afternoon, she baked an extra loaf of cornbread. She wrapped it in a clean cloth with a piece of smoked jerky and left the small bundle on a fence post she knew he would pass on his way home. She didn't wait to see him find it. It was an offering, a quiet statement. "I see you. I see your weariness." The next morning, the cloth was on her doorstep. It was empty, and it had been folded neatly, precisely. It was his reply. Thank you. I see you too. This silent conversation, this slow, careful dance of advance and retreat, became the rhythm of her days. It was a fragile thing, a seed trying to grow in rocky soil, and she cherished it. But the whispers in town were growing louder, turning from gossip to open hostility. Mrs. Pritchard had made it her personal crusade to drive Wren out, to protect Judson from the scheming widow. The threat was no longer just social. It was becoming a physical danger. The fuse had been lit. The crisis came on a hot, breathless afternoon. Wren had finished the last section of fence and was gathering her tools by the creek, not far from the bog. She was looking forward to the quiet of her shack, the small sense of peace she had carved out for herself. That peace was shattered when Sipes appeared. He wasn't on his horse. He was on foot, and he had been drinking. His eyes had a vicious gleam. "Work's done," he said, blocking her path. "Reckon you'll be moving on now. Or do you think you've sunk your hooks in deep enough to stay?" Wren clutched the handle of her fencing pliers, her knuckles white. "Get out of my way, Sipes." Her voice was low and even, betraying none of the fear that was coiling in her stomach. His lip curled into a sneer. "Calloway ain't here to protect you now. He's a sad, lonely man. But he'll get tired of your charity case act. A woman like you needs a real man to look after her. Someone who knows what to do with you." He lunged, grabbing her arm. His grip was like iron. Wren reacted instinctively, swinging the heavy pliers, but he caught her wrist, twisting it until she cried out in pain and dropped the tool. He was strong, his beery breath hot on her face. "Feisty, ain't ya?" he grunted, pulling her closer. "I like that." Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She was alone. The shack was too far away. No one could hear her. She was back to that first day. A woman with nothing, at the mercy of a world that wished her ill. She fought, kicking and struggling, but he was laughing, a low, ugly sound, enjoying her terror. He was forcing her back toward the thick reeds by the water's edge, just as despair threatened to swallow her whole. A sound cut through the air, a furious, piercing whistle, followed by the thunder of hooves. It wasn't Judson, it was a horse, a magnificent black stallion charging toward them. It was Diablo, Judson's prized stud, the sire of the colt she had saved. He was notoriously wild, a horse that only Judson could ride, a creature of fire and fury that tolerated no one else. But Wren had seen the loneliness in the stallion, a mirror of its master's. For weeks, she had been leaving it small offerings, a crisp apple, a handful of oats, on the fence posts. She had spoken to it in the same low, soothing tones she had used with the sinking colt. She had never tried to touch it, only to offer a quiet, undemanding friendship. She had gentled it with kindness, a secret between her and the wild animal. Now her secret friend had come to her aid. The stallion saw her distress, saw the man handling her with violence. With a scream of equine rage, Diablo reared up, his front hooves flashing in the sun, striking at the air just inches from Sipes's head. The foreman yelled in terror and scrambled backward, falling over a log. The horse didn't charge him. It planted itself between Wren and the fallen man, its head low, its teeth bared in a clear, unmistakable threat. It was protecting her. At that exact moment, Judson Calloway crested the ridge. He had been riding to tell her the fence was good work, perhaps to find the courage to say more. Instead, he saw the scene below. His foreman on the ground, Wren disheveled and terrified, and his untamable stallion standing guard over her like a loyal dog. Everything became clear in an instant. The whispers, Sipes's resentment, Wren's fear. He spurred his horse, his face a mask of cold, lethal fury. He was off his horse before it even stopped, striding past the protective stallion, which allowed him to pass without a challenge. He ignored Wren for a moment, his entire focus on the man scrambling to his feet. "Sipes, Judson's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried more menace than a shout. "You're fired. Get your things. Be out of this county by sunrise. If I ever see your face on my land again, I will personally see you buried on it." Sipes, pale and trembling, opened his mouth to protest, to lie, to blame her. But he saw the look in Judson's eyes and his words died in his throat. He nodded, once, and scurried away like the rat he was. The commotion had drawn others. 2 ranch hands, and further down the track, Mrs. Pritchard and 2 other townswomen, their curiosity having led them on an afternoon stroll. They had seen it all. The attack. The stallion's defense. The firing. Judson turned, his rage receding, replaced by a deep, quiet resolve. He saw the townspeople watching, their faces a mixture of shock and avid curiosity. He saw the judgment, the whispers waiting to take flight, and he knew this was the moment, the fence line, the choice. He walked to Wren, who stood trembling, her arms wrapped around herself. He didn't say a word. In front of his men, in front of the town's gossiping heart, he reached out and took her hand. Her small, calloused, blistered hand. He held it as if it were the most precious thing he had ever touched. He turned to face Mrs. Pritchard, his voice ringing out clear and strong for all to hear. "This woman," he said, his thumb stroking the back of Wren's hand, "showed more courage and decency pulling my colt from that bog than I have seen in this entire town in a year." He looked directly at the matriarch, his eyes cold as a winter river. "You judged her. You condemned her. And you were wrong." Then he did the one thing no one ever expected. He let his own wall crumble. His voice softened, filled with a pain that was years old. "I have been half alive since my wife died," he said, his gaze finding Wren's. "I closed this ranch off. I closed myself off. I was a man living in a house of ghosts." He took a breath, the confession costing him everything. She came here with nothing but sorrow, and instead of taking, she gave. She saved my colt. She did the work of 2 men. She faced down fear. She reminded me that the world isn't just about loss. He squeezed her hand. "She is with me," he declared, the words a vow. "If you have a problem with her, you have a problem with me." It was a public, irreversible choice. He had chosen her over reputation, over the town's petty judgment, over the safety of his own solitude. He had rescued her from the whispers and the threats. But as he stood there, his heart exposed for all to see, his need for her laid bare, Wren knew the truth. With her quiet strength, her patient kindness, and her refusal to be broken, she had been rescuing him all along. She had pulled him from a bog of his own, a mire of grief and loneliness that was just as deadly as any patch of mud. The rescue was mutual. Autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek in shades of gold and rust. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and curing hay. Wren was no longer in the line shack. Its door was repaired, and it now housed a new young ranch hand and his wife. Her home was at the Calloway Ranch, not as a servant or a guest, but as a presence, a warmth that had begun to fill the hollow spaces of the large, quiet house. She stood in the spacious kitchen, the heart of the home, arranging bundles of dried herbs on a set of new pine shelves. Judson had built them for her last week, without her asking. He had seen her collection of medicinal plants and wild teas overflowing from a small crate and had simply appeared one evening with the smooth, fragrant boards. He had mounted them on the wall himself, his movements precise and careful. It was his way of saying, "Your things belong here. You belong here." The house had changed. Laughter was sometimes heard, a foreign sound that was slowly becoming familiar. Wren had taught the stern, silent cook how to bake her father's apple cake, and the 2 women now shared a companionable silence in the kitchen. The ranch hands, who had once viewed her with suspicion, now tipped their hats and called her Mrs. Wren, their respect hard-won and genuine. The story of Sipes and the stallion had become ranch legend, a tale that cemented her place not as the boss's woman, but as a force in her own right. Diablo, the black stallion, grazed peacefully in the paddock just outside the kitchen window. He would often come to the fence when she was nearby, resting his great head on the top rail to accept a piece of apple from her hand. He was still a wild thing at heart, but he had found a place of trust with her, a calm center in his fiery spirit. He was a living symbol of the bond she and Judson shared, something born of wildness and grief, gentled by patience and a quiet, persistent kindness. The back door creaked open and Judson came in, bringing the cold evening air with him. He was tired, the lines around his eyes etched deep from a long day on the range. He hung his hat on the peg by the door, a ritual she had come to love, the signal that he was home, that the world was being shut out for the night. He walked over to the stove to pour himself a cup of coffee, his movements weary. He didn't speak. He rarely did after a long day. Words were not his currency. He came and stood behind her as she straightened a bundle of dried chamomile. He looked at the shelves, at the neat rows of her herbs, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He was a man who was slowly, painstakingly, learning how to be happy again. He reached out, not to touch her, but to run a finger along the smooth edge of the shelf he had built. A gesture of pride, of creation. Wren turned. "It's a good shelf," she said softly. "It's a good wall," he replied, his voice a low rumble. His eyes met hers, and in their stormy depths, she saw not the closed-off, damaged rancher she had first met, but the man he was becoming. Vulnerable, open, hers. He had not made any grand declarations of love, no flowery speeches. His love was in the firewood stacked by her door, the fence that protected her, the shelf that held her treasures. It was in the way he said her name. He closed the small space between them and placed his hand on the small of her back. The touch was warm, solid, a quiet anchor in the vastness of the frontier. It was a gesture of possession and protection, of partnership and peace. They stood there together in the warm, fragrant kitchen, the silence comfortable and complete. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. It was no longer just his ranch, his kingdom. The frontier was still wild, the winters were still hard, but it was no longer a place of endings for Wren. Looking out at the endless sky, his hand warm on her back, she knew she had finally found her home.